Oh, well.
Apparently, I have wanderlust, and I like to move, but I need to stop.
All right, folks, good morning. All right, folks, good morning. Okay, I got one response on that one. That's good. Hey, Anita. Hey, Doug. Good morning. Is Nancy here for Maddie? Debbie?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's good. Well, we're moved. If you are present and you were present yesterday, thank you for helping us. The first day, Friday, we tried to do it just me and Chris, and it took 12 hours. And then everybody showed up yesterday to help us get the rest of the stuff, and that was great. So we are in the new house. Hey, Shane, good morning. Got a big backyard now, Andrea. Just throwing it out there. All right. We are in the book of Hosea. We're in chapter 5, correct? $10? I'm hearing 10 and 6. 10? Did we finish 5 and we're on to 6 now? Is that what's happening? Well, you guys know better than me, apparently. All right. I was thinking if we're in chapter 5, we need to start putting on the gas a little bit and keep on rolling through this text. But here we are in chapter 6. Right, Faye? Faye knows all, so I ask Faye. See her every day. All right, chapter 6, verse 1. Come, let us return to the Lord because he has... Well, okay, if you all haven't picked up already, whenever I see the word for in the ESV, I just say because it helps my brain keep a flow of it. For means because in this context. It's just grammatically, it helps me to kind of connect that a little bit. So it'll say for, and I'll say because every single time. Because he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down and he will bind us up. So obviously we're talking about the coming punishment that's going to be hitting the Israelites. One thing I did not mention last week that I wasn't too confident on, so I didn't tell you what the truth was. I didn't know the truth for sure. The idea of Ephraim being talked about in chapter 5 so much. I was trying to figure out why Ephraim was talked about specifically, and I forgot the fact that Ephraim is used as a synecdoche when it comes to Israel, so it's the same idea there. They're just kind of emphasizing one tribe as being the most influential in the north, because obviously Judah on the south with Jerusalem was significant, and so was Benjamin. Those two are kind of just the south, really, and then you have the north. Ephraim seems to be the most prominent one discussed. So like verse 14 of the previous chapter, for I will be like a lion to Ephraim and a young lion to the house of Judah. That's that Hebrew parallelism where they say the same thing twice, two different ways. So you have the parallel being Ephraim and then Judah, so the north and the south, right? So that's one thing I wanted to remind you of. I wasn't too confident last week, and so I wanted to mention it. Okay, verse 2. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. That's one of those things that you'll find a lot in like Psalms and Proverbs, where you have like 6 is talked about, or 11's talked about, and then for 12, so you have like the additional number there. That's part of that kind of apocalyptic literature we talked about so much in previous classes, where the numbers or the names or the amount of time isn't really specific. It's not, where is Caitlin? I can pick on her a little bit. It's not literal, it's kind of parallel, right? It's apocalyptic, it's symbolism. So for 2 days he will revive us, third day he will raise us up. Obviously, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing there. Being resurrected in the third day seems to be a prominent thing of our whole religion, right? Around that Easter time, we're thinking about that a little bit more. So keep that in mind, that we may live before him. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. And so a more just kind of poetic way of describing how confident the Lord is in his will being fulfilled. If you'll remember from last week, verse 3, let us press on to know the Lord. The people are ruined because of what? A lack of knowledge, right? So the people have forgotten who God truly is. So his call to action here, the prophetic word, is make sure you remember and you know who God is. And we'll talk more about that during our sermon. Verse 4, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? So there's that northern tribe in scope. What shall I do with you, O Judah? Southern tribes. Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. So the idea of God reflecting on the love of his people, being fleeting, being passing, is kind of like the mist or the dew that you'll see in the morning, the fog. The sun rises up and kind of just gets rid of that moisture, right? So that's kind of the image that God has of his people. Therefore, verse 5, I have hewn them by the prophets. What's hewn mean? H-E-W-N. Cut them down, right? Beat them up, cut them down. And then there is that parallel verse just after that, I have slain them by the words of my mouth. So if you didn't know already, I've talked about it almost relentlessly, so hopefully you picked it up by now, that the idea of using that Hebrew parallelism, same thing, two different ways, is for emphasis, right? So he's trying to drive that point home. And my judgment goes forth as the light. Because, verse 6, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Okay. Does that sound familiar to you? Obedience is better than sacrifice, right? It's there. It's also in Deuteronomy. It's echoed a little bit in Exodus. It's talked about in Psalms a lot, how the Lord desires obedience rather than sacrifice. It's actually quoted for us 2 different times in the New Testament as well, once by Jesus, once by Paul. And so this kind of theme of not missing the main point seems to be important to keep in mind. And we'll talk again more about that during our sermon. Did the Lord require sacrifice of the people? Did he require burnt offerings? Yes, he did. If they were to neglect that, would that be okay with God? No, but they're missing the point. They're missing the main thing. The impetus of them actually going through with those sacrifices and burnt offerings, the reason why they were doing it was because they wanted to be obedient to a loving Heavenly Father, not because they were required to, and therefore they checked that box. If you were here during our massive power outage last week during our sermon, for a split second, that shut down the whole stream, right, which was not recorded. After that, I kind of had a little bit more to say about having those check boxes of making sure you're here on Sunday mornings, making sure that you're doing all the things, and that's not good enough. That's not the point, right? It's not we're checking off boxes, it's that we're actually living the life that God wants us to live. That's why we emphasize that, is because God emphasizes that so often through the previous and current covenant we have with him. Okay, verse 7. If you have any comments, don't be afraid. I know you guys aren't, to speak up. Okay? All right, verse 7. This is a little bit unusual to find, especially in the Old Testament. But here's this. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. Hear that car alarm. I pause in my brain for a second. How to get louder? Oh. It's Doug's fault. Okay. We don't find a whole lot of literature, especially in the Hebrew Bible, about the idea of Adam being the one who transgressed the covenant. That sounds more like Romans, right? That's a Romans 5, 6, 7 thing that's talked about a lot. And there are some denominations that emphasize the fall of Adam a whole lot more than maybe we do. because we look at it primarily through the lens of looking at the first man being a typical man, a human, someone who's fallible, someone who's sinful, that kind of thing. We don't place a whole lot of emphasis religiously on the actual transgression of Adam being the one that kind of set the stage for all of us to fall after him. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah. Yeah, they were both covenants. His was a bit simplistic. Yeah, so this being here, we bring sometimes a lot of baggage to areas where there's a lot of discussion, especially in our day and age, when you have certain denominations talking about the fall of Adam, or you might say original sin, right? That's a big thing with some groups. And we don't emphasize that as much. We just simply lump it into the category really of he was a human like us, and like he fell, we fall, right? So that's again Romans, which is why that book is tricky for us sometimes, because we bring a lot of baggage to Romans that wasn't there when Romans was written. So I think he's just making the parallel here that just like humankind through Adam or man fell, the same way that this covenant is being failed as well by the Israelites. Any questions or thoughts about that? No thoughts? That's great. Oh, well, there's a covenant with Adam for sure. Yeah. I mean, it was simplistic compared to others, right? He was to tend and work the garden. That was his job. Protect it, be an image bearer, if you want to use that phraseology from the Bible Project. He was to represent God as the creator, and they were made in his image. And so mankind, Adam, man, was supposed to tend and keep and protect the garden. That was his job. And there were some things that he was allowed to do, like protect it, like keep it, and eat from any tree of the garden. And there was one prohibition, as far as we know. Don't eat from the one right in the middle of it, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from that one. And yep, there were sacrifices that were made. Some people look at the idea of when they knew they were naked before God, and then God gave them garments made with the hides of animals. So cattle, maybe, right? Sheep, maybe, I don't know, whatever God killed to be able to give them garments or clothing. They look at that as the first sacrifice. It's not stated that way, and it's a kind of a stretch in my mind, but maybe that's what it is. And then you find Cain and Abel later offering things to God, no doubt from Adam's instruction from what God told them they were required to do. Cain was not accepted, Abel was. So it's a whole lot not said clearly for us. And it doesn't really matter, big picture, because we're not under that covenant anyway. We're a couple of covenants removed from that. But it is interesting to kind of see what's not told to us in that story. Okay, verse 8, Gilead is a city of evildoers tracked with blood. Okay, so we're getting right to the point again. There is a balm in Gilead, right? We sing that? Well, not in this day and age. As robbers lie in wait for a man, so the priests band together. They murder on the way to Shechem. They commit villainy. Well, that's not great when the priesthood is talked about here as being like a band of robbers trying to prey upon the weak. That's what they were doing, in a sense, preying upon the weak spiritual nature of the Israelites. In the house of Israel I have seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there. Israel is defiled. For you also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed when I restore the fortunes of my people. Some translations have a comma going right into chapter 7, so-called. One thing mentioned here, Ephraim's whoredom. What is that in reference to? Yeah, idolatry, right? So keeping in mind here that in Hosea you've got a whole lot of parallels between adultery, whoredom, prostitution, and then also idolatry. Those things are almost synonymous within the book. If you'll keep in mind here, chapter 1 and chapter 2, Hosea was told to go marry somebody, Gomer, right? And what was her profession? The oldest one they have, prostitution, right? So she was to go out she was going to go out and commit prostitution, and that was the idea, is him making a parallel to the people, saying just like Hosea is a faithful husband, a man of God, and the wife is unfaithful, that's like God and the people being unfaithful. That was the whole image illustration there for this book. Okay, so when I restore the fortunes of my people, chapter 7, verse 1, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is revealed, and the evil deeds of Samaria, because they deal falsely. Their thief breaks in, and the bandits raid outside. So the same kind of illustration there. Questions, comments, thoughts?
In the end of chapter 6,
Yep.
it refers to Ephraim and Israel.
Yep.
What's the difference?
Okay, so Ephraim is talked about as kind of a catch-all for all of the northern tribes of Israel. So when you see Ephraim in this text, we're talking about the northern tribes of Israel. You see Judah, southern tribes. Okay? Let's see, verse 2. So this is Hosea chapter 7, verse 2. But they do not consider that I remember all their evil. That's pretty common, wouldn't you think? That people do their things that they think that are done kind of maybe even in secret, and that the Lord's still watching. I mean, I've heard some sermons and some thoughts that that's kind of a safeguard for us to kind of keep in the back of our mind the Lord knows who we are and what we do, even in secret, so-called. I think it's valuable, it's biblical, but maybe a little guilt-trippy sometimes, you know? I don't know, that's my personal feeling about that. If I hear a sermon that's all about, make sure that you know the Lord's watching you in secret, like, I get it. I know what you mean, but at the same time, it's a bit infantile for me. Like, if that's what, as a newer convert, if that's what kind of keeps you reminded that the Lord's still watching, that's great. But, I mean, you can go too far with that and then just always feel guilty all the time and forgetting that God knows what we're all about, who we are, what we're made of, and that He's made a way out of our nature, if you will. So that's just my personal feelings for what that's worth. Not a whole lot. Now their deeds surround them. They are before my face. But their evil they make the king glad, and the princes by their treachery. They are all adulterers. They are like a heated oven whose baker ceases to stir the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. So they're going to be burnt. Take that for what you will. Okay. Thoughts about that one? Okay, verse 5. On the day of our king, the princes became sick with the heat of wine. Anyone need an illustration of what that's all about? I'm sure you might have known a person or two in your life who have become sick with the heat of wine, or a lager, or whatever they're into, whiskey. All right. He stretched out his hand with mockers, because with hearts like an oven they approach their intrigue. All night their anger smolders, in the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are as hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls upon me. So they go through different leaders, and none are the satisfaction for what they're looking for, because none of them, in the north especially, ever went back to God. Right? We talked about before how many good kings have the northern tribes had historically? None. How many in the south? 5, 6, maybe. All right, a couple of them we know a lot more about than the others. Some are just mentioned as being good kings. Okay, verse 8. Ephraim mixes himself with the peoples. Ephraim is a cake not turned. So what's the problem in verse 8 with mixing yourself with the peoples? Yeah, I mean, it's the entire book of Joshua. All right, Joshua doing a pretty good job following the path that Moses laid out for them. And when they finally kind of conquered the land, they were supposed to go there and wipe them out completely. They didn't do that, of course, and because of that, they were going to be a thorn in the side of the people continually up until this point historically in the text.
The influence is so strong that you would think Solomon in all his wisdom would have known how to stay true to God and not let outside influence. But what did he do? He married from other nations, and he set up idols for others to worship.
He had a couple of wives, didn't he? couple. What's the breakdown, like 700 and 300? Or 600 and 400? 7,000 wives or concubines? 1,000 total, right? I mean, how? I mean, I got one, and my plate is full, folks. I can't even imagine. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of a puzzling thing, isn't it? That the thing that Solomon asked for at the beginning of his reign, and God said, I'll give you a blank check. Whatever you want, you've got it. And what did he ask for? Wisdom to rule your people. Good start, right? I mean, it's a good start. And then you look at the thing, and you look at the history books, especially in 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, it was written after the exile to kind of remind them what happened. You look at that text, and it's not a theological text. It is, but it's not. Not in the sense of, when you look at the things written about in historical accounts from the Hebrew Bible and even in the book of Acts, for example, it just tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you a whole lot of devotional things about it, right? So when you find that there are things like, a good example is this. Rahab, the harlot, right? So they went up there. Rahab hid the spies because she wanted to go with the people. They had heard about the conquest the Israelites were making through the whole territory of Canaan. And then she lied to the guards about her not knowing where those spies were. Was that a good thing or a bad thing?
God can bring good things out of bad.
Well, that becomes a slippery slope real quick.
It was a good thing.
Okay, it's a good thing. To lie, right, Lisa? Lying is good. Yeah, that's what I say. It depends on what you mean.
In that situation.
In that situation, it was okay to lie. Okay, that's why I'm doing all this, because, yeah, we teach our kids don't lie. It's not good for you, right? God doesn't like you to bear false witness, which means to lie. Fancy way of saying it, right? But was lying okay for Rahab?
Yes, it was.
Bring that.
If she told the truth, would God somehow save the spies?
Yes.
Yes.
Maybe.
Not for certain. Maybe.
Maybe.
All day long.
I mean,
Whatever you want.
got a couple of guys thrown into a burning fiery furnace, and they turned out okay. All right. So the point is this: when you read a historical account, it doesn't comment on the morality of the actions that were done. You just have a record of what took place. Does we have any kind of condemnation for Rahab for lying in the text? No. Can we make a case that she shouldn't have lied? Yeah, you can. It turned out okay for them in that moment, in that brief glimpse. Same thing is true of a historical account. You don't find a commentary based on the morality of what actions were taken. You have a record of what actions were taken. So when you look at things like that, it's important to kind of keep that in mind historically. You don't find a commentary on whether or not they were good or bad calls. Same thing with Solomon. Asked for wisdom, that was great. And then you read the rest of the account of what he actually did, and they were not wise decisions in my estimation. He kind of just did what God said not to do, although he had all the wisdom from God. So whether he applied that wisdom is debatable, obviously. So anyway, that's one of those things about Solomon that's interesting, is he's got that much wisdom, made some bad calls. Kelly?
Wasn't it more of a better her than us as far as lying?
Oh, Rahab?
Yeah.
I guess, but that can be you can rationalize and deceive yourself through a lot of bad decisions. You say, well, it's just like Rahab, you know. God needs me to lie here
She
because...
wasn't considered a child of God, or she wasn't Jewish.
Well, she wasn't, but she's in the bloodline of Jesus, so she was pretty important. If she wasn't there, we wouldn't have a Savior.
Well, this is one of those things, we talk all day long about it. Does it matter? No. Did she do it? Yes. Did it turn out good? Yeah, great.
Yeah. Well, we can move on until people start to use that rationale in their own lives. Because there are a lot of situations where you can think, well, you know what, in just this one time, what I need to do is just do this thing that I know is not right, but it's going to all work out in the end. And then it kind of snowballs, and you see decisions that are made out of poor rationale. That's why that one little statement I've mentioned before to you, is always good to do good. It's always bad to do bad. It's never good to do bad. It's always bad to do good. So the idea there is, if you're thinking, hey, is this decision I'm about to make, despite my intentions, is it right or wrong? If you kind of stick with that, that kind of gives you a true north to kind of follow a little bit. So.
In order to spread the gospel, it makes him no better than the people that he's trying to preach to.
Yep. Yep. So it's an interesting thing. And of course, if you want to read more about this, there's a little bit of material for you to digest if you're so interested. Lisa's not, but if anybody else wants to read it, you can.
I'm all for moving on here.
Mm-hmm. All right. I don't know how we get there. I blame Faye. She can take it. Okay. Verse 10, the pride of Israel testifies to his face, yet they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. All right, let's give you a pop quiz. In the middle clause of verse 10, yet they do not return to the Lord their God. You might have a capital L-O-R-D with 1 point lower font. What does that indicate to us? Yahweh, right? Yahweh, the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters of the Hebrew, anglicized Hebrew, that gives us the name of God, the great I am, if you will, I am who I am, or I am that I am, whichever you prefer. The Lord, their God, Elohim. So the idea of personal name, their deity. Nor seek him for all of this. So a lot's happened to kind of try to get them to wake up to the reality of where they are spiritually. It's not working so far. Verse 11, Ephraim is like a dove. Again, with the Hebrew and talking about animals as illustrations, a little bit ambiguous. It's a little unclear. We're talking about a dove here, talking about a stork here, talking about a falcon here, some kind of animal, right? And then here's how the animal is described: silly and without sense. So you might have a different animal there. Anyone have a different animal besides dove in your text? Whatever version you're carrying. So you'll have like a gazelle, or as the deer pants for water. Not really a deer, probably, but we like to sing that song anyway, right? So whatever animal we're talking about here, as opposed to this, they're silly and without sense, calling to Egypt, going to Assyria. So what's that all about? Do you remember? Yep. So things are looking rough, right? They have enemies within and without, and they're looking to become stronger in a military way. So they're making political, military alliances. Going to, of all places, Egypt. Yeah, God said, don't do that. They're like a reed that you want to lean on, and they're going to pierce your hand when they break in half. This goes back to that original thought we've been kind of carrying throughout the minor prophets. The idea of them forgetting their origin story. Remember that conversation? Because they kind of forgot where they came from, slavery in Egypt, they have no memory of why it would be a problem to make a military alliance with Egypt, of all people. They never came to help. The military never showed up when Assyria came, when Babylon came. Egypt was like, yeah, you guys are on your own, sorry. Right? That's how Egypt kind of worked in that day and age. And then they're making a military alliance with, of all people, this little empire that popped up out of nowhere, called Assyria. They said, well, we just give you tribute, and you can be kind of our backup, right? If we need help against the Philistines or whoever, then you can help us, right? Assyria, they go, yeah, no problem. How much stuff do you guys have, by the way? A lot? Okay, well, we'll come down and we'll see what works. Of course, the north was taken away to Assyria. Verse 12, as they go, I will spread over them my net. I will bring them down like birds of the heaven. I will discipline them according to the report made to their congregation. So what you guys hear the prophet is talking about, it's going to happen. Woe to them because they have strayed from me. Destruction to them because they have rebelled against me. It's almost like God knew they were going to do this. It's almost like God told them generations ago, you guys are going to do this. And it's almost like Moses on the mountain said, you have choices to make. Either you do what God told you to do, remember who he is, make sacrifices to him and him alone, and you'll be blessed. And if you don't, you'll be cursed. right? That's kind of the origin of this covenant, the agreement they made. And they all said, yeah, we'll do it. We'll teach our kids who you are and what you require, and we'll tell them these stories, and we'll tell them who we are. They're never going to forget. And then they forgot. A couple generations later, it's all over.
Well, Alan,
Yep.
that's the crux. The generations did not teach as they should have.
Absolutely.
The chief priests did not do what they were supposed to do. You know, God sends the prophets and all this stuff, they didn't pay the attention. But it goes back for generations that the lack of adults not doing what they should do.
So what's the lesson for us? Yeah, that's about right. If we want our kids to be the future generation of the church, to continue on the Lord's mission, we have a job to do, don't we? Now, whether or not you did your job in your household or your parents did their job in their household, it really starts with you, right? Despite the failings and the shortcomings of previous generations, we now have a chance to get this right. And you shouldn't feel necessarily the weight of shame and guilt if that wasn't done for you, if you're not currently doing it. I've seen people before. There's one that comes to mind, and it's to me it's heartbreaking. It's not as dramatic as something else could be, but I could just see the pain on a couple's face that were members of a church where I preached. And their pain was when they had young kids, they were unfaithful to the church. And when they became faithful to the church, once again, their kids were already grown up and out of the house. So when they came back and rededicated themselves and were doing what was right, it was too late to reach their kids. So every time you talked about youth events or talked about young adults, that you just see a little bit of hurt in their eyes because they missed the window of influence they had for their own children. And I met their kids, and they're good people, but they don't see the value of church because they didn't grow up in it. And they hear about it from their parents who are now faithful members, and then they just don't see the connection. They don't get why it's important because it wasn't shown to them why it's important. So anyway, all that to say, this happened for Israel. We're reading about it now, and they're going to reap what they sowed. And it's their fault, ultimately, but it wasn't helped by the previous generation's backsliding away from the covenant. So we have to be vigilant as people that have influence. Whether or not you have kids, you can be a positive influence on others that are around you, right? Okay. Woe to them, they've strayed from me. Destruction to them, they rebelled against me. I would redeem them. What's that mean? Redeem? Buy back, saved, forgiven? Yeah. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it? Well, if you sing it, you better know what it means, right? So the idea is, I want to bring them back, but they speak lies against me. They do not cry to me where? From the heart. You can cry out if things are going rough for you. Ask for God to help you this one time only, right? When things are going terrible in your life, you usually go back to God, which is a good thing, but it's got to be genuine, from the heart. But they wail upon their beds for grain and wine. They gash themselves. They rebel against me. So God wants to bless them. He wants to give them the things that they need and even the things that they want. But they're not turning back to God from the heart in a genuine way. They're wailing from their beds. Oh, we don't have enough food. They gash themselves. What's that indicate? Idol worship, right? Remember 1 Kings 17? Is that where it is? Elijah? I think chapter 18. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe 18 is when they do Mount Carmel, and then 19 is a depression. I think it's 17 and 18. Somebody correct me. 1 Kings 17 should be Mount Carmel. 1 Kings 18 should be he's depressed. You want to verify? I need to know. 17 should be Mount Carmel. 18's Carmel? Okay, so 19's depression? Anyway, somewhere in there, you have them having a showdown with the priests or the prophets of Baal, or Baal, whatever you want to pronounce it. And you've got the people there trying to get Baal to send down fire or take the sacrifice that they made. And it's a good sacrifice. So what do? They cry, they wail, they lash themselves with whips to try to open up their backs to have the blood pour down, all to get Baal's attention. And then you have Elijah saying, maybe he's taking a nap. Maybe he's on a trip. Why isn't Baal answering you? Weird. And then he prays to God one time. He puts water all over his wood sacrifice, his animal sacrifice. And then fire from heaven comes down. They go, oh, I guess God is here. And Baal is not. Weird. So that's part of that kind of idol worship, is to hurt yourself to get God's attention. Okay. Verse 15, although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. So he's been there preparing them for all of this, and they turned against God. Verse 16, they return, but not upward. You know, up where God is, right? You remember that imagery? Going up the mountain to get closer to where God is, because he's up there? It's kind of funny, but there it is. They are like a treacherous bow. What's that mean?
Straight,
Like shade.
true.
All right.
It'll betray you.
I'm not going to go.
To go one way and it goes another.
I'm not going to go too far into the story, but I will say, I learned, my parents were divorced when I was a kid, and I learned pretty quickly, if I tell my mom I want something, and I tell my dad I want something for Christmas, I get two of those things. I mean, I was an ingenious kid. I thought I had, this is perfect. So I'm like, Mom, I want a bow and arrow. She says, great, okay. She gets me a longbow. Dad, I want a bow and arrow. He gets me a compound bow. I'm like, I got two bows and I got a bunch of arrows. This is awesome. And then that year I heard Mom and Dad say, okay, we need to talk about what we're getting our kids, because we're getting too many things that are the same. I'm like, well, whatever, it's a good thing. But the longbow was a little fiberglass bow, little kid bow. I was like 10 or 11. And don't know what they were thinking of bow and arrow, but anyway. I used the compound bow more, for sure. And it was a good little bow. And the longbow I didn't use for a good little while. Tried to use it one day, and the string, the bowstring, had kind of dry rot a little bit. Pulled that thing back with a target arrow in there, and it snapped and got me right in the face. Similar thing here. God's using that same illustration here. They're like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. They shall be their derision in the land. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. So in Egypt are going to hear about how mighty they've fallen and say, well, it wasn't us. Okay, chapter 8, verse 1. Kind of a famous chapter. Set the trumpet to your lips. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. There might be a little imagery here that we're not picking up what they're putting down in text. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord. If you just look at that on the surface level, you've got, okay, so you see a vulture, what do you think of?
Yes.
Yeah, something got ran over. And they are ready for it, right? They are just there. There's something dead, and they're going to devour whatever is dead. But also there's a little bit of imagery here. Did you catch it? So vultures normally have wings, don't they? What else is talked about as having wings biblically? Whatever angels are, kind of are described to have wings. Seraphim, the word seraphim is the plural of sarah. And sarah is the Hebrew word for snake, which kind of throws you for a loop, because whenever seraphim are talked about, you have snakes. But these snakes have wings that cover their eyes, cover their feet, which is a biblical nice way to say to cover their genitalia. And then they have wings to fly. So they have those three sets. So whenever you think about a seraphim, you think about a nice little pale person, usually with wings, right, that fly white dove wings. They look like flying snakes. That's what it is, literally, biblically, which is wild. Then when you talk about the snake in the garden, by the way, this is definitely chasing a rabbit now. When you see the snake in the garden, and part of the punishment was on his belly he shall crawl, we always assume that, well, maybe snakes had legs. Maybe snakes had wings originally in the creation, which is even more terrifying to me. I don't like snakes that even crawl on their belly, much less if they're flying around, I'm okay. I'm all right. George, save us.
Also a symbol of Syria, if you want to carry it to the prayer. The winged lion, the winged prince. So you could see this as an obscure reference to Syria.
Yeah. They definitely flew around and took their prey, didn't they? Okay, we're going to pause here to verse 2 of the text, and we'll keep it going next week. We've got 2 chapters knocked out. How about that? Hit the gas now. Thank you so much for your time and your attention this morning. We'll be dismissed now for about 20 minutes before worship begins.